All right, so due to the technology issues that I wrote to you about, I'm going to try to do this old school and film it. I apologize for how dark this looks, but I think you should still be able to see it. What we're going to look at right now is basically how to test validity in categorical logic. And there's two basic tests that we're going to look at. The first one is referred to as the rules method. The other one is the coined word method. The rules method is the first one. It was created by Aristotle back at the very beginning of logic. And it explains to us that any valid categorical syllogism has to meet 5 basic rules. And if it meets all 5 of those rules, then we know that it's valid. If it violates even one of those rules, then we know that it's going to be invalid. So, on the screen here I have an argument that you've seen before, at least the form of, all A are B, all C are A, therefore all C are B. That's an AAA figure 1 syllogism, which I know is valid. And so we're going to use that as our paradigm case as we go through these rules. And then we will also, of course, look at some examples that are not valid. So the first rule, actually the first 2 rules that we're going to have to deal with that issue of distribution that we talked about last week. So remember that wherever the book says distribute, all you really have to do is circle it. That's the way the check is going to work. So rule number 1 says the middle term must be distributed at least once. All right, so the middle term must be distributed, circled, at least once. All right, so if we look at our paradigm case over here, we see that what we have are A statements. Remember your distribution chart. In an A statement, you circle the subject. In an E statement, you'd circle the subject and the predicate. In an I statement, don't circle anything. And in an O statement, you'd circle just the predicate. So all of the statements that we have here are A statements, so we would circle the subject in each of those, just like that. Now, we can see that the middle term, which is the one that's used twice in the premises, not at all in the conclusion. In this case, the A, the rule says that that middle term has to be distributed, has to be circled at least once, and we see that it is. So it meets the first rule, it meets the first criteria, and that's great. But it doesn't mean that it's a valid argument yet. It just means that it meets the first rule. But if it violates the rule, then we know that it's invalid. So let's say we take this argument, all A are B, all C are B, therefore all C are A. Now if we go through and mark distribution, again these are all A statements, so we'd circle the subject term in each of those. But the middle term, the one that's used twice in the premises, not in the conclusion, in this case is the B. So you can see that the middle term is not circled at all in either of these. So I know that this is an invalid argument because it violates that first rule. Now there are specific fallacy names that are associated with these, and so this one is simply referred to as the fallacy of undistributed middle. Okay, so the fallacy of undistributed middle. So that's the first rule that it has to meet. The second rule says that if any term is distributed in the conclusion, then it has to be distributed in the premises. Okay? So if anything is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premises. We could see that according to Rule 2, both of the arguments up here meet that criteria. We can see that the C is circled in the conclusion of this one because it's in the subject position of an A statement. And we also see the C being circled here for the same reason. So what's circled in the conclusion is circled in the premise, and the same thing with this one. But let's say we have an argument such as this. All A are B, some A are C, therefore some C are not B. So if we mark our distribution here, with an A statement, you'd circle the subject. With an I statement, you don't circle anything. With an O statement, you circle just the predicate. And so we see that the B is circled down here in the conclusion, but it's not circled up here in the premise. So this one we know is invalid because it violates that second rule. Now there are two fallacy names associated with this. One is illicit major, the other is illicit minor, and it just depends upon where the problem is in terms of your premises. So this one, the issue where the B is not circled, is in the major premise, so this commits the fallacy of illicit minor. And so those are the first two rules. Those are also the more difficult rules because they deal with this issue of distribution. The other three are actually pretty easy. And in many cases with these, you wouldn't even have to see an argument written out. You could just look at the mood and tell whether it meets that criteria or not. The third rule says that you cannot have two negative premises. Okay? So very simple, you cannot have two negative premises. One negative premise is fine, but you cannot have two. If it is, it's invalid. So our paradigm case over here, you see the A's, those are affirmative, right? Remember, the A and the I are affirmative, the E and the O are negative. So if I have an argument that is no A or B, some B are not C, therefore no C are A, we would see, for example, here the E and the O, those are both negative premises, so we know that this one is invalid. And in this case, it's referred to as the fallacy of exclusive premises. Okay. Now again, what's nice about this is the fact that you don't actually need to see an argument written out. If you're looking at your mood and you see EE, it doesn't really matter what the conclusion is, but your premises EE, OO, EO, OE. Any of those combinations, you know that it's invalid because it violates this third rule, which says that you cannot have two negative premises. The fourth rule says that a negative premise requires a negative conclusion, and a negative conclusion requires a negative premise. So, if you have one negative premise, because you're not allowed to have two, if you have one negative premise, then your conclusion has to be negative. So we'll just say a negative premise requires a negative conclusion, and vice versa. Now, again, in our paradigm case, we can see that all of the statements are A statements, which are positives. So there are no negatives there at all for us to worry about. So that's okay. But what if you have an argument that looks like this? All A are B, some C are B, therefore some C are not A. Okay. Well, in this case, we see that we have an O conclusion. Some C are not A. It's an O statement and negative conclusion. Rule 4 says, since there's a negative conclusion, we need a negative premise. But both of our premises are positive, right? You have an A statement and an I statement. Those are both affirmative. So we know that this one is invalid. Okay. Now, validity is going to be based here, or invalidity rather, is based here upon this fourth rule. The fallacy name is far too long to write out for this one. It would be the fallacy, it's either the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise, or the fallacy of drawing a negative premise from an affirmative conclusion. That's just too much to write. So for this one and this one only, you can just list Rule 4 as being the reason or the rationale as to why. Okay. And once again, this is another one where you wouldn't actually have to see the whole argument written out. All you'd have to do is look at the mood, and you'd be able to tell whether it met this criteria or not. I won't give you all of them because there's a lot. But if you have, for example, EAA, right, you can see E is a negative premise, but A is a positive conclusion, so that wouldn't work. If we have AAE, right, you have two affirmative or positive premises, but your conclusion is negative. If you have AOO, AIO, again, A and I are both positive, O is negative. So there's a lot of possibilities there, but anytime you have that configuration, that's going to make it invalid because of Rule 4. Because if you have a negative premise, you need a negative conclusion. If you have a negative conclusion, you need a negative premise. And finally, Rule 5 says that if both of the premises are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. So two universal premises cannot have a particular conclusion. So remember again that the A and the O are universal, the A and the E are universal, the I and the O are particular. So with that being the case, you know what it is that you're looking for on these. You need two universal premises, the A or the E, leading to a particular conclusion, or an I or an O, and that will make this an invalid argument. So again, our paradigm case there, we can see that we do have two universal premises. They're both A, but they also lead to a universal conclusion, so we're good there. We can see that that one has met all 5 of these rules, and that means that we can refer to it as a valid argument. Okay. But if you have, let's say, all A are B, no C are A, therefore some C are B, well, that one would be an example clearly where you have two universal premises, the A and the E, leading you to a particular conclusion, which is the I. That one is going to be considered invalid because it violates this 5th rule, And the fallacy here, this is referred to as the existential fallacy. Not to be confused with the existential fallacy that we talked about in Chapter 1. This one is unique to categorical logic. It's related, but it's unique to it. All right, so here you have another situation where all you really have to look at is the mood and the figure, and you will be able to tell whether it violates this rule or not. So if you saw AAI, for example, AEO as an example, anytime you saw two universal premises leading to a particular conclusion, you would know that it would violate this basic rule. So that's the way that the rules method works. It is set up in such a way that if we find that all 5 of these rules are met, the argument is valid. And if it violates even one, it might violate more than one, but if it violates even one of these rules, then the argument would be invalid. All right. So that's all I have time for on this video because they chopped me off after about 18 minutes for some reason. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this one, and in the next one I'll teach you a much easier method for testing validity.